The sixth book, entitled Erato. Aristagoras, the author of the Ionian revolt, perished in the way which I have described. Meanwhile, Histiaeus, tyrant of Miletus, who had been allowed by Darius to leave Susa, came down to Sardis. On his arrival, being asked by Artaphernes, the Sardian satrap, what he thought was the reason that the Ionians had rebelled, he made answer that he couldn't conceive, and it had astonished him greatly, pretending to be quite unconscious of the whole business. Artaphernes, however, who perceived that he was dealing dishonestly, and who had in fact full knowledge of the whole history of the outbreak, said to him, "I'll tell thee how the case stands, Histiaeus. This shoe is of thy stitching. Aristagoras has but put it on." Such was the remark made by Artaphernes concerning the rebellion. Histiaeus, alarmed at the knowledge which he displayed, so soon as night fell, fled away to the coast. Thus he forfeited his word to Darius, for though he had pledged himself to bring Sardinia, the biggest island in the whole world, under the Persian yoke, he in reality sought to obtain the direction of the war against the king. Crossing over to Chios, he was there laid in bonds by the inhabitants, who accused him of intending some mischief against them in the interest of Darius. However, when the whole truth was laid before them, and they found that Histiaeus was in reality a foe to the king, they forthwith set him at large again. After this, the Ionians inquired of him for what reason he had so strongly urged Aristagoras to revolt from the king, thereby doing their nation so ill a service. In reply, he took good care not to disclose to them the real cause, but told them that King Darius had intended to remove the Phoenicians from their own country and place them in Ionia, while he planted the Ionians in Phoenicia, and that it was for this reason he sent Aristagoras the order. Now, it wasn't true that the king had entertained any such intention, but Histiaeus succeeded hereby in arousing the fears of the Ionians. After this, Histiaeus, by means of a certain Hermippus, a native of Artenius, sent letters to many of the Persians in Sardis, who had before held some discourse with him concerning a revolt. Hermippus, however, instead of conveying them to the persons to whom they were addressed, delivered them into the hands of Artaphernes, who, perceiving what was on foot, commanded Hermippus to deliver the letters according to their addresses, and then bring him back the answers which were sent to Histiaeus. The traitors being in this way discovered, Artaphernes put a number of Persians to death, and caused a commotion in Sardis. As for Histiaeus, when his hopes in this matter were disappointed, he persuaded the Chians to carry him back to Miletus. But the Milesians were too well pleased at having got quit of Aristagoras to be anxious to receive another tyrant into their country, besides which they had now tasted liberty. They therefore opposed his return, and when he endeavoured to force an entrance during the night, one of the inhabitants even wounded him in the thigh. Having been thus rejected from his country, he went back to Chios, whence, after failing in an attempt to induce the Chians to give him ships, he crossed over to Mytilene, where he succeeded in obtaining vessels from the Lesbians. They fitted out a squadron of 8 triremes and sailed with him to the Hellespont, where they took up their station and proceeded to seize all the vessels which passed out from the Euxine, unless the crews declared themselves ready to obey his orders. While Histiaeus and the Mytileneans were thus employed, Miletus was expecting an attack from a vast armament which comprised both a fleet and also a land force. The Persian captains had drawn their several detachments together and formed them into a single army, and had resolved to pass over all the other cities which they regarded as of lesser account, and to march straight on Miletus. Of the naval states, Phoenicia showed the greatest zeal, but the fleet was composed likewise of the Cyprians, who had so lately been brought under, the Cilicians, and also the Egyptians. While the Persians were thus making preparations against Miletus and Ionia, the Ionians, informed of their intent, sent their deputies to the Panionium, and held a council upon the posture of their affairs. Hereat it was determined that no land force should be collected to oppose the Persians, but that the Milesians should be left to defend their own walls as they could, At the same time, they agreed that the whole naval force of the states, not excepting a single ship, should be equipped and should muster at Lade, a small island lying off Miletus, to give battle on behalf of the place. Presently the Ionians began to assemble in their ships, and with them came the Aeolians of Lesbos. And in this way they marshalled their line. The wing towards the east was formed of the Milesians themselves, who furnished 80 ships. Next to them came the Prienians with 12, and the Myusians with 3 ships. After the Myusians were stationed the Tyans, whose ships were 17, then the Chians, who furnished 100, the Eretrians and Phoenicians followed, the former with 8, the latter with 3 ships. Beyond the Phocians were the Lesbians, furnishing 70. Last of all came the Samians, forming the western wing, and furnishing 60 ships. The fleet amounted in all to 353 triremes. Such was the number on the Ionian side. On the side of the barbarians, the number of vessels was 600. These assembled off the coast of Milesia, while the land army collected upon the shore. But the leaders, learning the strength of the Ionian fleet, began to fear lest they might fail to defeat them, in which case, not having the mastery at sea, they would be unable to reduce Miletus, and might in consequence receive rough treatment at the hands of Darius. So, when they thought of all these things, they resolved on the following course. Calling together the Ionian tyrants, who had fled to the Medes for refuge when Aristagoras deposed them from their governments, and who were now in camp, having joined in the expedition against Miletus, the Persians addressed them thus: Men of Ionia, now is the fit time to show your zeal for the house of the king. Use your best efforts, every one of you, to detach your fellow countrymen from the general body. Hold forth to them the promise that if they submit, no harm shall happen to them on account of their rebellion. Their temples shall not be burnt, nor any of their private buildings. Neither shall they be treated with greater harshness than before the outbreak. But if they refuse to yield, and determine to try the chance of a battle, threaten them with the fate which shall assuredly overtake them in that case. Tell them, when they are vanquished in fight, they shall be enslaved. Their boys shall be made eunuchs, and their maidens transported to Bactra, while their country shall be delivered into the hands of foreigners. Thus spake the Persians. The Ionian tyrants sent accordingly by night to their respective citizens, and reported the words of the Persians. But the people were all staunch, and refused to betray their countrymen, those of each state thinking that they alone had had overtures made to them. Now these events happened on the first appearance of the Persians before Miletus. Afterwards, while the Ionian fleet was still assembled at Lade, councils were held and speeches made by divers persons, among the rest by Dionysius, the Phocian captain, who thus expressed himself: Our affairs hang on the razor's edge, men of Ionia, either to be free or to be slaves, and slaves too who have shown themselves runaways. Now then, you have to choose whether you will endure hardships, and so for the present lead a life of toil, but thereby gain ability to overcome your enemies and establish your own freedom, or whether you will persist in this slothfulness and disorder, in which case I see no hope of your escaping the king's vengeance for your rebellion. I beseech you, be persuaded by me, and trust yourselves to my guidance. Then, if the gods only hold the balance fairly between us, I undertake to say that our foes will either decline a battle, or, if they fight, suffer complete discomfiture. These words prevailed with the Ionians, and forthwith they committed themselves to Dionysius, whereupon he proceeded every day to make the ships move in column, and the rowers ply their oars, and exercise themselves in breaking the line, while the marines were held under arms, and the vessels were kept till evening fell upon their anchors, so that the men had nothing but toil from morning even to night. 7 days did the Ionians continue obedient, and do whatsoever he bade them. But on the 8th day, worn out by the hardness of the work and the heat of the sun, and quite unaccustomed to such fatigues, they began to confer together, and to say one to another, What god have we offended to bring upon ourselves such a punishment as this? Fools and distracted that we were, to put ourselves into the hands of this Phocian braggart, who does but furnish 3 ships to the fleet. He, now that he has got us, plagues us in the most desperate fashion. Many of us, in consequence, have fallen sick already. Many more expect to follow. We had better suffer anything rather than these hardships. Even the slavery with which we are threatened, however harsh, can be no worse than our present thraldom. Come, let's refuse him obedience." So saying, they forthwith ceased to obey his orders, and pitched their tents, as if they had been soldiers, upon the island, where they reposed under the shade all day, and refused to go aboard the ships and train themselves. Now when the Samian captains perceived what was taking place, they were more inclined than before to accept the terms which Aeacus, the son of Seleucen, had been authorized by the Persians to offer them, on condition of their deserting from the confederacy, for they saw that all was disorder among the Ionians, and they felt also that it was hopeless to contend with the power of the king, since if they defeated the fleet which had been sent against them, they knew that another would come 5 times as great. So they took advantage of the occasion which now offered, and as soon as ever they saw the Ionians refuse to work, hastened gladly to provide for the safety of their temples and their properties. This Aeacus, who made the overtures to the Samians, was the son of Seleucen and grandson of the earlier Aeacus. He had formerly been tyrant of Samos, but was ousted from his government by Aristagoras the Milesian at the same time with the other tyrants of the Ionians. The Phoenicians soon afterwards sailed to the attack, and the Ionians likewise put themselves in line and went out to meet them. When they had now neared one another and joined battle, which of the Ionians fought like brave men and which like cowards I can't declare with any certainty, for charges are brought on all sides. But the tale goes that the Samians, according to the agreement which they had made with Aeacus, hoisted sail, and quitting their post, bore away for Samos, except 11 ships, whose captains gave no heed to the orders of the commanders, but remained and took part in the battle. The state of Samos, in consideration of this action, granted to these men, as an acknowledgment of their bravery, the honour of having their names, and the names of their fathers, inscribed upon a pillar, which still stands in the marketplace. The Lesbians also, when they saw the Samians, who were drawn up next to them, begin to flee, themselves did the like, and the example, once set, was followed by the greater number of the Ionians. Of those who remained and fought, none were so rudely handled as the Chians, who displayed prodigies of valour, and disdained to play the part of cowards. They furnished to the common fleet, as I mentioned above, 100 ships, having each of them 40 armed citizens, and those picked men on board. And when they saw the greater portion of the allies betraying the common cause, they for their part, scorning to imitate the base conduct of these traitors, although they were left almost alone and unsupported, a very few friends continuing to stand by them, notwithstanding went on with the fight, and oft times cut the line of the enemy, until at last, after they had taken very many of their adversaries' ships, they ended by losing more than half of their own. Hereupon, with the remainder of their vessels, the Chians fled away to their own country. As for such of their ships as were damaged and disabled, these, being pursued by the enemy, made straight for Mycale, where the crews ran them ashore, and abandoning them, began their march along the continent. Happening in their way upon the territory of Ephesus, they essayed to cross it, but here a dire misfortune befell them. It was night, and the Ephesian women chanced to be engaged in celebrating the Thesmophoria. The previous calamity of the Achaeans had not been heard of, so when the Ephesians saw their country invaded by an armed band, they made no question of the newcomers being robbers who purposed to carry off their women, and accordingly they marched out against them in full force and slew them all. Such were the misfortunes which befell them in Chios. Dionysius the Phocian, when he perceived that all was lost, having first captured 3 ships from the enemy, himself took to flight. He wouldn't, however, return to Phocia, which he well knew must fall again, like the rest of Ionia, under the Persian yoke, but straightway as he was, he set sail for Phoenicia, and there sunk a number of merchantmen, and gained a great booty. After which he directed his course to Sicily, where he established himself as a corsair, and plundered the Carthaginians and Tyrrhenians, but did no harm to the Greeks. The Persians, when they had vanquished the Ionians in the sea fight, besieged Miletus, both by land and sea, driving mines under the walls, and making use of every known device, until at length they took both the citadel and the town, 6 years from the time when the revolt first broke out under Aristagoras. All the inhabitants of the city they reduced to slavery, and thus the event tallied with the announcement which had been made by the oracle. For once upon a time, when the Argives had sent to Delphi to consult the god about the safety of their own city, a prophecy was given them, in which others besides themselves were interested, for while it bore in part upon the fortunes of Argos, it touched in a by-clause the fate of the men of Miletus. I'll set down the portion which concerned the Argives when I come to that part of my history, mentioning at present only the passage in which the absent Milesians were spoken of. This passage was as follows: Then shalt thou, Miletus, so oft the contriver of evil, be thyself to many a feast and an excellent booty. Then shall thy matrons wash the feet of long-haired masters. Others shall then possess our loved Didymian temple. Such a fate now befell the Milesians, for the Persians, who wore their hair long after killing most of the men, made the women and children slaves, and the sanctuary at Didyma, the oracle no less than the temple, was plundered and burnt, of the riches whereof I've made frequent mention in other parts of my history. Those of the Milesians whose lives were spared, being carried prisoners to Susa, received no ill treatment at the hands of King Darius, but were established by him in Empe, a city on the shores of the Eretrian Sea, near the spot where the Tigris flows into it. Miletus itself and the plain about the city were kept by the Persians for themselves, while the hill country was assigned to the Carians of Pedasus. And now the Sybarites, who after the loss of their city occupied Laius and Skidrus, failed duly to return the former kindness of the Milesians. For these last, when Sybaris was taken by the Crotoniates, made a great mourning, all of them, youths as well as men, shaving their heads. Since Miletus and Sybaris were, of all the cities whereof we have any knowledge, the two most closely united to one another. The Athenians, on the other hand, showed themselves beyond measure afflicted at the fall of Miletus, in many ways expressing their sympathy, and especially by their treatment of Phrynichus. For when this poet brought out upon the stage his drama of the capture of Miletus, the whole theatre burst into tears, and the people sentenced him to pay a fine of 1,000 drachmas for recalling to them their own misfortunes. They likewise made a law that no one should ever again exhibit that piece. Thus was Miletus bereft of its inhabitants. In Samos, the people of the richer sort were much displeased with the doings of the captains and the dealings they had had with the Medes. They therefore held a council very shortly after the sea fight, and resolved that they wouldn't remain to become the slaves of Aeaces and the Persians, but before the tyrants set foot in their country would sail away and found a colony in another land. Now it chanced that about this time the Zancleans of Sicily had sent ambassadors to the Ionians and invited them to Caliacte, where they wished an Ionian city to be founded. This place, Caliacte, or the Fair Strand, as it's called, is in the country of the Sicilians, and is situated in the part of Sicily which looks towards Tyrrhenia. The offer thus made to all the Ionians was embraced only by the Samians, and by such of the Milesians as had contrived to effect their escape. Hereupon this is what ensued. The Samians, on their voyage, reached the country of the Epizythrian Locrians, at a time when the Zancleans and their king, Sithus, were engaged in the siege of a Sicilian town which they hoped to take. Anaxilaus, tyrant of Rhegium, who was on ill terms with the Zancleans, knowing how matters stood, made application to the Samians and persuaded them to give up the thought of Caliacte, the place to which they were bound, and to seize Zancli itself, which was left without men. The Samians followed this counsel and possessed themselves of the town, which the Zancleans no sooner heard than they hurried to the rescue, calling to their aid Hippocrates, tyrant of Gela, who was one of their allies. Hippocrates came with his army to their assistance, but on his arrival he seized Sithus, the Zanclean king, who had just lost his city, and sent him away in chains, together with his brother, Pythogenes, to the town of Inicus, after which he came to an understanding with the Samians, exchanged oaths with them, and agreed to betray the people of Zancli. The reward of his treachery was to be 1/2 of the goods and chattels, including slaves which the town contained, and all that he could find in the open country. Upon this Hippocrates seized and bound the greater number of the Zancleans as slaves, delivering, however, into the hands of the Samians 300 of the principal citizens to be slaughtered, but the Samians spared the lives of these persons. Sithus, the king of the Zancleans, made his escape from Inicus and fled to Himera, whence he passed into Asia and went up to the court of Darius. Darius thought him the most upright of all the Greeks to whom he afforded a refuge, for with the king's leave he paid a visit to Sicily, and thence returned back to Persia, where he lived in great comfort and died by a natural death at an advanced age. Thus did the Samians escape the yoke of the Medes, and possess themselves without any trouble of Zancli, a most beautiful city. At Samos itself, the Phoenicians, after the fight which had Miletus for its prize was over, re-established Aeacus, the son of Seleucon, upon his throne. This they did by the command of the Persians, who looked upon Aeacus as one who had rendered them a high service, and therefore deserved well at their hands. They likewise spared the Samians on account of the desertion of their vessels, and didn't burn either their city or their temples, as they did those of the other rebels. Immediately after the fall of Miletus, the Persians recovered Caria, bringing some of the cities over by force, while others submitted of their own accord. Meanwhile, tidings of what had befallen Miletus reached Histiaeus the Milesian, who was still at Byzantium, employed in intercepting the Ionian merchantmen as they issued from the Euxine. Histiaeus had no sooner heard the news than he gave the Hellespont in charge to Pisaltes, son of Apollophanes, a native of Abydos, and himself at the head of the Lesbians set sail for Chios. One of the Chian garrisons which opposed him he engaged at a place called the Hollows, situated in the Chian territory, and of these he slaughtered a vast number. Afterwards, by the help of his Lesbians, he reduced all the rest of the Chians, who were weakened by their losses in the sea fight, Polychne, a city of Chios, serving him as headquarters. It mostly happens that there is some warning when great misfortunes are about to befall a state or nation, and so it was in this instance, for the Chians had previously had some strange tokens sent to them. A choir of 100 of their youths had been dispatched to Delphi, and of these only 2 had returned, the remaining 98 having been carried off by a pestilence. Likewise, about the same time, and very shortly before the sea fight, the roof of a schoolhouse had fallen in upon a number of their boys, who were at lessons, and out of 120 children there was but 1 left alive. Such were the signs which God sent to warn them. It was very shortly afterwards that the sea fight happened, which brought the city down upon its knees, and after the sea fight came the attack of Histiaeus and his Lesbians, to whom the Chians, weakened as they were, furnished an easy conquest. Histiaeus now led a numerous army composed of Ionians and Aeolians against Thasos, and had laid siege to the place when news arrived that the Phoenicians were about to quit Miletus and attack the other cities of Ionia. On hearing this, Histiaeus raised the siege of Thasos and hastened to Lesbos with all his forces. There his army was in great straits for want of food. whereupon Histiaeus left Lesbos and went across to the mainland, intending to cut the crops which were growing in the Aegeanian territory, and likewise in the plain of the Caicus, which belonged to Mysia. Now it chanced that a certain Persian named Harpagus was in these regions at the head of an army of no little strength. He, when Histiaeus landed, marched out to meet him, and engaging with his forces, destroyed the greater number of them, and took Histiaeus himself prisoner. Histiaeus fell into the hands of the Persians in the following manner. The Greeks and the Persians engaged at Melina, in the region of Antonius, and the battle was for a long time stoutly contested, till at length the cavalry came up, and charging the Greeks, decided the conflict. The Greeks fled, and Histiaeus, who thought that Darius wouldn't punish his fault with death, showed how he loved his life by the following conduct. Overtaken in his flight by one of the Persians who was about to run him through, he cried aloud in the Persian tongue that he was Histiaeus the Milesian. Now, had he been taken straightway before King Darius, I verily believe that he would have received no hurt, but the king would have freely forgiven him. Artaphernes, however, satrap of Sardis, and his captor Harpagus, on this account, because they were afraid that if he escaped he would be again received into high favour by the king, put him to death as soon as he arrived at Sardis. His body they impaled at that place, while they embalmed his head, and sent it up to Susa to the king. Darius, when he learned what had taken place, found great fault with the men engaged in this business for not bringing Histiaeus alive into his presence, and commanded his servants to wash and dress the head with all care, and then bury it as the head of a man who had been a great benefactor to himself and the Persians. Such was the sequel of the history of Histiaeus. The naval armament of the Persians wintered at Miletus, and in the following year proceeded to attack the islands off the coast, Chios, Lesbos, and Tenedos, which were reduced without difficulty. Whenever they became masters of an island, the barbarians in every single instance netted the inhabitants. Now the mode in which they practice this netting is the following. Men join hands so as to form a line across from the north coast to the south, and then march through the island from end to end and hunt out the inhabitants. In like manner the Persians took also the Ionian towns upon the mainland, not however netting the inhabitants, as it wasn't possible. And now their generals made good all the threats wherewith they had menaced the Ionians before the battle. For no sooner did they get possession of the towns than they chose out all the best favoured boys and made them eunuchs, while the most beautiful of the girls they tore from their homes and sent as presents to the king, at the same time burning the cities themselves with their temples. Thus were the Ionians for the third time reduced to slavery, once by the Lydians, and a second, and now a third time, by the Persians. The sea force, after quitting Ionia, proceeded to the Hellespont, and took all the towns which lie on the left shore as one sails into the straits. For the cities on the right bank had already been reduced by the land force of the Persians. Now these are the places which border the Hellespont on the European side: the Chersonese, which contains a number of cities, Perinthus, the forts in Thrace, Celebria, and Byzantium. The Byzantines at this time, and their opposite neighbours, the Chalcedonians, instead of waiting the coming of the Phoenicians, quitted their country and sailed into the Euxine, took up their abode at the city of Mesembria. The Phoenicians, after burning all the places above mentioned, proceeded to Proconnesus and Artica, which they likewise delivered to the flames. This done, they returned to the Chersonese, being minded to reduce those cities which they hadn't ravaged in their former cruise. Upon Cyzicus they made no attack at all, as before their coming the inhabitants had made terms with Oiberes, the son of Megabazus and satrap of Dascylium, and had submitted themselves to the king. In the Chersonese the Phoenicians subdued all the cities excepting Cardia. Up to this time, the cities of the Chersonese had been under the government of Miltiadis, the son of Cimon, and grandson of Stesichorus, to whom they had descended, from Miltiades, the son of Cypselus, who obtained possession of them in the following manner. The Dolonci, a Thracian tribe, to whom the Chersonese at that time belonged, being harassed by a war in which they were engaged with the Absinthians, sent their princes to Delphi to consult the oracle about the matter. The reply of the Pythonians